My name is Grace Davis and I am 34 years old. If you want to know what betrayal feels like, it does not come with yelling or slammed doors. It comes with a ballroom full of applause meant for you, given to someone else. It comes wrapped in a custom suit and delivered over a microphone by the man who raised you. I was sitting at table 1 inside the Statler Hotel in downtown Dallas. 200 industry executives were eating dry chicken and drinking expensive champagne. I was the vice president of operations for Davis Freight and Logistics. I was also the person who had just spent 14 months negotiating an $80 million contract with Apex Retail. This deal was the finish line. It was the contract that took our regional trucking company and turned it into a southern empire. My father, Richard Davis, walked up to the microphone. He was 62 years old. He wore a custom suit and a smile he reserved for bankers and board members. He tapped the microphone. The room went quiet. 14 years, my father said. His voice echoed over the speakers. That is how long Davis Freight has been fighting to become the premier logistics network in Texas. Today we reached the summit. The Apex contract secures our future for the next decade. People clapped. My husband Daniel found my hand under the table. He squeezed my fingers. I squeezed back. My chest felt tight, but it was a good kind of tight, the kind that comes after running a marathon. I had given my 20s to this company. I had missed weddings, canceled vacations, and worked through the flu just to keep our trucks on the highway. This night was supposed to be the moment my father finally looked at me and acknowledged that I was the architect of his legacy. But a new era requires fresh leadership, Richard continued. He looked at the front row. His eyes skipped over me. They did not even pause. It requires a visionary, someone who understands the modern landscape. Tonight, it is my honor to announce the new Chief Executive Officer of Davis Freight and Logistics, my daughter, Olivia Davis. The air left the room, or maybe it just left my lungs. Olivia was 29. Her official title was Director of Brand Relations. In reality, her job consisted of expensing lunches at high-end steakhouses and taking curated photos in front of our loading docks for social media. She had never routed a truck. She had never negotiated a tariff. She stood up, smoothed her designer dress, and walked toward the stage. She hugged our father. She flashed a practiced smile for the business reporters taking photos near the bar. She looked like she belonged there. She looked like she earned it. But here is what none of them knew. Not my father, not my sister, not the executives clapping for a woman who did not know the difference between a freight bill and a bill of lading. They were celebrating a victory they did not own. And in exactly 72 hours, my phone would register 97 missed calls from the two people on that stage. This is how it happened. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where we share real-life stories about family justice, quiet strength, and the moments that change everything. If this is your first time here, drop a comment with your age and let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a story. The ballroom was spinning, but I forced my eyes to stay focused on the centerpieces, white roses and silver ribbons. I kept my breathing slow and even. If you have ever been the scapegoat in a family business, you know the rule. You do not react. You do not give them the satisfaction of your tears. Olivia took the microphone. Her voice was breathy, rehearsed. She thanked our father for his trust. She talked about synergy and brand optimization, words that meant nothing when a rig broke down on Interstate 35 at 2 in the morning. She did not mention the Apex deal. She did not mention the 14 months of negotiations. She did not mention my name once. Daniel turned to me. His jaw was tight. His knuckles were white against the dark linen tablecloth. He was a forensic accountant. He understood fairness and he understood numbers. He knew exactly what this company was worth and he knew exactly who built it. Grace, he whispered. His tone was a warning, a question, a lifeline all at once. It is fine, I said. My voice did not shake. My hands were steady. A cold clarity washed over me, the kind of clarity that makes the world look incredibly sharp. I had spent 12 years waiting for my father to see me. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just closed one more impossible deal, he would finally hand me the respect I had earned. But sitting at that table, watching Olivia hold up a crystal award, the truth settled into my bones. He was never going to give it to me. He wanted my labor, but he wanted her on the throne. I reached up to the lapel of my blazer. I unclipped my security badge. The plastic felt heavy in my palm. It held my youth. It held every holiday dinner I left early to handle a dispatch emergency. I placed it gently on the table right next to a slice of untouched chocolate tart. The white plastic contrasted sharply with the dark tablecloth. I stood up. I pushed my chair in. The scrape of the wood against the floor was loud enough to make the regional manager sitting next to me turn his head. He looked at the badge, then looked at me. I offered him a polite, brief smile. I walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. I did not run. I did not storm out. I walked with the posture of a woman who knew exactly what she was leaving behind. Daniel followed me. We walked through the lobby, past the valet stand, and out the glass doors into the warm Dallas night. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. The valet brought our car. We got in. Daniel drove. The streetlights flickered across the dashboard, casting long shadows inside the cabin. "Are you going to fight this?" Daniel asked. His eyes stayed on the road. "No," I said. I looked out the window at the passing city skyline. "I am going to let them run it." He nodded. He did not ask another question. Back in that ballroom, my father and sister were drinking champagne, thinking they had just inherited a Southern logistics empire. They thought they had secured a future built on an $80 million contract. They thought I would wake up the next morning, swallow my pride, and go back to being the worker bee who kept their machine running. They did not realize they had just inherited a ghost ship. The system running that network, the proprietary software that won the Apex deal, did not belong to Davis Freight. It belonged to me. And the moment I left that badge on the table, the countdown started. The trucks would finish their night routes, the drivers would clock out, but tomorrow everything was going to break, and they were going to have to fix it without me. The drive back to our house in the suburbs was quiet. Daniel kept the radio off. I watched the highway lines blur into a single white ribbon and thought about the empire my father believed he had just handed to my sister. To understand the trap they were walking into, you have to understand how a modern freight network actually operates. My father started his business with 2 used flatbed trucks in the late 1980s. He was a man of diesel grease and firm handshakes. He believed logistics was just moving a box from point A to point B, and for a long time it was. But the industry evolved. By the time I graduated with a degree in supply chain management and joined the company moving freight was no longer about handshakes. It was about data. For the last 10 years, I was the person managing that data. I worked 80-hour weeks. I sat in windowless dispatch centers at 3 in the morning to route drivers around blizzards in the Panhandle. I sat across the table from union representatives and negotiated contracts that kept our labor force from striking during the holiday rush. I built the operational infrastructure that allowed Davis Freight to scale from a regional carrier to a statewide powerhouse. My reward was a desk next to the server room and a salary that sat 20% below industry standard. My father called it paying my dues. He told me that family sacrifices for family. Olivia joined the company 5 years after I did. She had just dropped out of a public relations program at a mid-tier university. My father immediately created a title for her, Director of Brand Relations. He gave her a corner office with a view of the Dallas skyline. He leased a luxury SUV under the company name for her to use. She received unlimited paid time off. My father had a very specific worldview. In his mind, men built legacies. Pretty women represented those legacies, and competent women maintained the machinery in the background. Olivia was the face. She attended charity luncheons on the company dime. She played golf with potential investors. She looked like the people my father wanted to be. I looked like the person he expected to do the actual work. I never fought him on it. I accepted the dynamic because I believed the work would eventually speak for itself. But the work never spoke loud enough to drown out his favoritism. I remember a specific Thanksgiving 3 years ago. It was the peak of the retail shipping season. A severe ice storm had hit the northern part of the state, throwing our entire delivery schedule into chaos. Our legacy dispatch system was failing under the strain. If we did not reroute 70 trucks before dawn, we were going to face penalty fees that would wipe out our quarterly profit. I did not eat turkey that year. I sat at my kitchen table for 14 hours straight, drinking black coffee, manually coding a server patch to bypass the failing dispatch nodes. My eyes burned, my fingers cramped. Daniel brought me plates of food that went cold next to my keyboard. While I was rewriting code to save our profit margin, I opened a separate browser tab to check our corporate social media accounts. Olivia was supposed to be monitoring client updates. Instead, she had posted a photo of herself on a beach in Cabo San Lucas. She was holding a margarita. The caption read, "Resting and recharging for the holiday rush." She had paid for the trip using her corporate card. My father had approved the expense as a networking retreat. When I finally fixed the server and called my father the next morning to report that the routes were stable, he did not thank me. He just asked if I had seen Olivia's photo and commented on how nice the weather looked in Mexico. He expected me to handle the crisis. It was my job to fix the engine while they enjoyed the cruise. That Thanksgiving was the turning point. I realized my father would never value my labor, so I decided to create something he could not afford to ignore. Our logistics infrastructure was outdated. As we grew, the old method of assigning routes on whiteboards and basic spreadsheets was suffocating us. We were bleeding money on fuel inefficiencies and deadhead miles, which is when a truck drives empty to pick up its next load. I went to my father and pitched a transition to an enterprise-level routing software. The licensing fee was substantial, but it would save us millions in operating costs over 5 years. My father laughed. He refused to sign the purchase order. He called it an absurd waste of capital. He said computers did not drive trucks, men did. He told me to just figure out a cheaper way to make the routes work. He gave me an impossible directive, assuming I would just put in another 80-hour week and piece together a temporary fix. I did figure it out, but I did not do it the way he expected. If my father was not going to pay a software company for a modern routing matrix, I was going to build one myself. But I was not going to build it for him. I spent the next 11 months coding a dynamic logistics algorithm from scratch. I worked on it during the weekends. I worked on it late at night after my regular shift ended. I did not use company equipment. I did not write a single line of code inside his building. The algorithm was a masterpiece. It tracked real-time weather patterns, traffic congestion, driver hours of service regulations, and fuel prices. It calculated the most efficient load distributions down to the minute. It was the system that eventually allowed us to bid on the Apex retail contract. They demanded flawless optimization, and my software delivered it. But here is the crucial detail my father missed because he was too busy admiring Olivia. When the software was finished, I hired an intellectual property attorney. I registered the copyright and the source code under a private limited liability company, an LLC that I owned entirely. My name, my asset. I brought a contract to my father's office on a Tuesday afternoon. I explained that I had developed a proprietary routing solution to fix our inefficiency problem. I told him my LLC would license the software to Davis Freight. My father looked at the thick stack of legal paper. He hated reading contracts. He hated the technical jargon. He flipped to the compensation page and saw the licensing fee I had structured, $1 a year. He smirked. He thought he had won. He thought he had bullied his worker bee daughter into building a custom enterprise system for free. He signed the bottom line without letting the corporate attorney read the clauses. He handed the contract back to me and told me to get it installed before the weekend. He missed Section 4, the termination clause. The contract explicitly stated that the $1 a year licensing agreement was a benefit provided strictly on the condition of my active employment as Vice President of Operations. If my employment was terminated, or if my job title was altered in any way without my written consent, the license would automatically revoke. Davis Freight would lose all access to the intellectual property immediately. Reinstating the license would require negotiating a new contract at current fair market value. My father did not read it. Olivia certainly did not read it. They just took the keys to the machine and assumed they owned the engine. As Daniel pulled our car into the driveway of our home, I looked at the dark sky above our roof. My father had just stood on a stage and handed my job, my title, and my future to a woman who thought logistics was a photo opportunity. He had fundamentally altered my employment status. He thought he had stripped me of my power. In reality, he had just triggered Section 4. I walked through my front door, took off my heels, and poured a glass of cold water. My phone was silent. The servers at Davis Freight were still running on automated night schedules, but in a few hours, the sun would come up. The morning dispatchers would arrive at the terminal. They would try to log into the matrix to assign the new Apex retail shipments, and they were going to find a lock on a door they did not even know existed. The sun rises early in the Texas suburbs, burning the dew off the grass before 6 in the morning. I woke up to the smell of dark roast coffee. The house was quiet, insulated from the heat and the noise of the city. I walked into the kitchen wearing sweatpants and an old college shirt. The heavy blazer from the gala felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Daniel was standing by the marble island pouring a second cup. He wore his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning a financial ledger on his tablet. As a forensic accountant, he spent his days tracking hidden assets, unraveling corporate fraud, and finding the lies people buried in spreadsheets. He understood the anatomy of a business collapse better than anyone. He handed me a ceramic mug. He did not ask how I was feeling. He just kissed my forehead and leaned against the counter. We stood in the silence of our kitchen, watching the morning light spill across the hardwood floor. It was a Tuesday. For the past 12 years, Tuesday mornings meant I was already at the dispatch center, holding a clipboard, arguing with warehouse managers about delayed shipments. Today, I was drinking coffee in my own home. The stillness felt foreign. It felt earned. At that exact moment, 20 miles away, the morning shift at Davis Freight and Logistics was starting. I knew the routine by heart. At 5:30, the warehouse bays open. The forklift operators begin moving pallets. The long-haul drivers finish their breakfasts in the break room, waiting for the digital manifest to hit their tablets. Today was different. Today was the launch of the Apex Retail Partnership. Apex demanded precision. Their agreement required all regional sorting to be finalized by 6 o'clock sharp. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-end retail inventory needed to be routed assigned to specific drivers and loaded into designated trailers. The logistics required a flawless symphony of data synchronization. Olivia, eager to play her new role, was undoubtedly sitting in the corner office. I pictured her setting her expensive iced latte on my old mahogany desk, ready to oversee the grand launch. She would open the executive dashboard, expecting to watch the fleet light up on the digital map like fireflies. She would expect the machine to simply run, assuming my absence was nothing more than a minor administrative hiccup. She clicked the login prompt. Back in my kitchen, I set my coffee mug down. I opened my personal laptop, resting it next to the fruit bowl. I bypassed the standard browser and opened my private server administration panel. The screen glowed with rows of deep blue text, indicating healthy local operations. I typed a quick command to pull up the external access logs. When I left the gala last night, I did not just walk away. I sent a standardized 2-sentence resignation notice to the Human Resources Department. The message was processed through the automated corporate directory. The moment Human Resources updated my file to reflect my departure, the system automatically deactivated my employee credentials. That automated deactivation was the trigger. The document my father signed 3 years ago tied the routing algorithm license directly to my active employment status. When my corporate badge was disabled, the application programming interface connecting the Davis Freight network to my private servers recognized the breach of terms. It executed a protocol I had coded myself. It severed the connection. I watched the terminal on my screen. At exactly 5:45, a line of bright red text appeared. Error 403, access denied. The ping originated from the executive floor IP address. Olivia was trying to authenticate. A few seconds later, another red line appeared. Then another. Then a dozen more. The red text cascaded down my screen like a waterfall. The terminal addresses belonged to the main dispatch hub. The warehouse floor, the driver routing tablets, every single access point in the company network was hitting a concrete wall. The grid was dark. I explained to Daniel what was happening on the screen. The proprietary matrix was the central nervous system of the entire freight operation. Without it, the company reverted to the Stone Age. The dispatchers could not see which trailers held the Apex goods. The drivers could not download their delivery sequences. The automated scale tickets would not print. The loading dock doors remained shut. Refrigerated trailers sat idling in the yard, burning diesel, while the temperature-sensitive cargo waited for destinations that no one could access. Olivia would be frantic. She would call the Internal Information Technology Department, demanding they fix the glitch. The technicians would scramble, tracing the dead connections, only to realize the source code did not live on their local drives. They would discover that the digital key unlocking their entire operation belonged to a private limited liability company owned by the woman they just humiliated. Daniel chuckled, tracing a finger over the red error logs. He understood the beauty of a flawless ledger. There were no loopholes. There was no ambiguity. The numbers in the code told the exact truth. My father had chosen to install a figurehead, and now the figurehead was sitting in a dark control room with no steering wheel. The red pings on my screen multiplied. 100 failed attempts, 200. The panic at the terminal would be spreading from the executive office down to the loading bays. The Apex retail compliance officers would be expecting their automated departure notifications. Those notifications were not coming. I watched the digital chaos for another minute. It was mesmerizing watching a multi-million-dollar infrastructure grind to a halt because it lacked the one component they refused to value: me. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, cutting off the stream of desperate server requests. I picked up my cell phone from the kitchen counter. The screen was clear. I swiped down and tapped the crescent moon icon, activating the Do Not Disturb feature. All calls would go straight to voicemail. All text messages would be silenced. I was no longer on their payroll. I was no longer their emergency contact. I owed them nothing. I slid the phone into my pocket and walked toward the sliding glass doors at the back of the kitchen. The morning air was warm as I stepped onto the patio. The backyard was my sanctuary. I had spent the last 3 spring seasons cultivating a garden along the cedar fence. It was a slow, methodical process, growing tomatoes, basil, and jalapenos from seeds. It required patience, attention, and care. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, ungrateful corporate machine I had just dismantled. I picked up the green watering can resting near the patio steps. I walked over to the raised planter beds. The soil was dry from the previous day's heat. I poured the water slowly, watching the dark earth absorb the moisture. The contrast was stark. I was standing barefoot in the grass, tending to a quiet garden, breathing in the scent of damp soil. Meanwhile, my father and my sibling were standing in a sterile dispatch center, watching their legacy unravel in real time. They were trapped in a crisis they manufactured, drowning in the consequences of their own arrogance. Daniel stepped onto the patio, holding his coffee mug. He leaned against the wooden railing, watching me water a row of basil plants. The peace in my backyard was profound, but I knew it was temporary. A man like Richard Davis does not accept failure. He does not view himself as someone bound by contracts or consequences. In his reality, he was the king, and kings do not negotiate with their subjects. They demand compliance. When the technical department finally explained the lockout to him, he would not see it as a legal boundary. He would see it as a personal attack. He would view my resignation not as a departure, but as an act of treason. And his first instinct would be to crush the rebellion using the only weapon he understood: intimidation and raw authority. I set the watering can down. The sun was fully over the horizon now, casting long, sharp shadows across the lawn. The silence was perfect, but the storm was gathering just beyond the city limits. The first wave of retaliation was coming, and it would not be a plea for help. It would be a threat designed to tear my life apart. The peace of the backyard was a temporary luxury. I finished watering the basil plants and walked back through the sliding glass doors into the kitchen. The air conditioning wrapped around me, a sharp contrast to the rising Texas heat outside. I set the green watering can by the sink and dried my hands on a towel. Daniel was still sitting at the marble island. He had pushed his tablet aside and was watching me. He pointed to the kitchen counter where I had left my phone. The screen was dark, but the small indicator light near the top was blinking a steady, rhythmic pulse. The Do Not Disturb feature had done its job. It had blocked the ringing, but it could not stop the digital trail of panic. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. The notification center displayed a long list of missed calls: 5 from the dispatch center, 3 from human resources, 14 from Olivia, and 4 voicemails from my father. I did not need to guess the contents. A man who builds a logistics empire from 2 used trucks does not handle a loss of control with grace. I tapped the icon to play the first message and set the phone on the counter, activating the speaker setting. Richard's voice filled the kitchen. The first message was recorded at 6:15 in the morning. His tone was clipped, annoyed, and dripping with the assumption that I was simply throwing a childish fit. Grace, pick up your phone. The dispatch screens are throwing error codes, and the warehouse managers cannot print the Apex manifests. I do not have time for this attitude today. You made your point last night, but we have a business to run. Text Olivia the administrator passwords right now so we can get the trucks moving. Call me back. The message ended. He still thought he was dealing with a sulking daughter. He thought 12 years of my dedication could be replaced by handing a password to a woman who spent her mornings curating social media feeds. I tapped the second voicemail. This one was recorded 20 minutes later. The annoyance had curdled into genuine anger. Grace, this is not a game. You are jeopardizing the Apex launch. The loading docks are paralyzed. The system says the access is restricted by an external server block. I know you set this up. Turn it back on. You are an employee of Davis Freight and you will do your job. He was wrong. I was not an employee. I had severed that tie the moment I walked out of the Statler Hotel. I played the final message. It was left just before 7 in the morning. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. It was the voice my father used when he was negotiating hostile takeovers or threatening union leaders. Listen to me very carefully. What you are doing is corporate sabotage. You are actively trying to destroy your own family. If you do not restore network access in the next 10 minutes, I am calling the legal department. I will have our attorneys draft a lawsuit before lunch. I will sue you for breach of contract, loss of revenue, and intentional damage to private property. I will drag you through the courts until you are bankrupt. You think you are smart, Grace, but you are playing a game you cannot afford to lose. Fix the system. The kitchen went silent. I looked at Daniel. He did not flinch. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a manila folder. He opened it and laid a single document flat on the marble counter. It was the software licensing agreement, the one my father had signed 3 years ago without reading the termination clause. He wants to play the legal game, Daniel said quietly. He adjusted his glasses and tapped the signature line at the bottom of the page. Let us show him the board. Daniel understood the power of a binding document. In his line of work, he watched arrogant men go to federal prison because they ignored the fine print. He knew that intimidation was just hot air, but a signed contract was concrete. We did not panic. We did not hire a defense attorney to brace for my father's wrath. We simply relied on the trap he had walked into willingly. I carried my laptop to the kitchen table and sat down. I opened a new email draft. I did not address it to my father. I did not address it to Olivia. Responding to them directly would validate their emotional manipulation. It would keep the conflict framed as a family dispute. I needed to elevate it to a corporate reality. I addressed the email to Mitchell, the general counsel for Davis Freight. Mitchell was a seasoned corporate lawyer who cared about mitigating risk, not protecting my father's ego. The subject line was sterile: notification of license termination and intellectual property boundary. I typed the message with careful clinical precision. Dear Mitchell, please find attached a copy of the software licensing agreement executed between Davis Freight and my private limited liability company. As per Section 4, my resignation from the position of Vice President of Operations constitutes an automatic and immediate termination of the $1 annual license. Davis Freight no longer possesses the legal right to access, utilize, or alter the proprietary routing matrix. I paused, referencing the notes Daniel had written in the margins of the folder. I needed to make sure the threat of a lawsuit was neutralized before it ever left my father's lips. I continued typing. I have been informed via voicemail that Richard Davis is attempting to bypass the external server blocks to regain access to the network. Please advise your client that the servers hosting the algorithm are my private property. Any unauthorized attempt to breach those servers, guess administrative passwords, or circumvent the access denial protocols constitutes a direct violation of the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I will report any further intrusion attempts to the authorities as a cybercrime. If Davis Freight wishes to negotiate a new fair market licensing agreement, you may contact my legal representation. Until then, all access remains permanently revoked. I attached the signed contract. I read the email twice to ensure the tone was devoid of emotion. Then I clicked send. I want to pause right here and speak directly to you. If you are listening to this and you are the person holding a family business together, hear this carefully. Loyalty is a beautiful concept, but it will not protect you in a boardroom. People who demand your unpaid labor will always accuse you of betrayal the moment you stop giving it to them for free. Never build your empire on someone else's land without a deed. Know your worth, and more importantly, get it in writing. When the emotional manipulation starts, a signature is the only shield that holds up. If you have ever had to demand your worth in writing, let me know your story in the comments. At the Davis Freight corporate office, that email hit Mitchell's inbox like a grenade. I could picture the sequence of events. Mitchell would read the email. He would open the attached contract. He would read Section 4. The color would drain from his face as he realized the vice president of operations had outmaneuvered the chairman years in advance. He would print the document and walk down the hallway to the executive suite. He would slide that paper across the desk to my father. He would have to explain to a man who never lost that he had already been checkmated. He would have to tell Richard that the daughter he viewed as a disposable worker bee held the keys to the kingdom, and suing her would only result in federal cybercrime charges for the company. The legal threat was dead on arrival. My father was cornered. He could not sue me, he could not hack my servers, he could not bully me over the phone because I was not answering. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. The Apex retail trucks were still grounded. The clock was ticking toward a massive breach of contract. In that moment of total realization, my father and Olivia had a choice. They could humble themselves, contact my attorney, and pay the millions of dollars the software was actually worth, or they could try to prove they did not need me at all. They chose pride. Olivia was sitting in the CEO chair. She was desperate to prove she was the visionary our father claimed she was. She looked at the frozen dispatch screens, the delayed Apex inventory, and the mounting pressure from the warehouse floor. She decided she was going to fix the supply chain collapse herself. She was about to make a decision that would bypass legal review, ignore safety protocols, and set the entire company on fire. And she was going to do it all with a single signature. The corporate standoff did not end with a screaming match. It ended with a quiet, undeniable reality check inside the executive suite. I was not there to witness it, but the industry network is a small, tightly woven community. Information travels faster than a freight train, especially when a giant is stumbling. When our general counsel Mitchell walked into my father's office and placed my email on the desk, the dynamic shifted instantly. My father read the legal boundaries I had drawn. He saw the reference to federal cybercrime laws. For the first time in his professional life, Richard Davis realized he could not bully his way out of a corner. The routing matrix was locked, and the key belonged to me. He had no legal standing to force my hand. That realization created a vacuum in the room, and nature abhors a vacuum. Olivia was sitting in the high-backed leather chair behind the CEO desk. She had spent her entire morning assuming the technical department would fix the glitch. She assumed my defiance was temporary, but as Mitchell explained that the system was legally untouchable, the weight of her new title finally landed on her shoulders. She was the chief executive officer. The $80 million Apex retail contract was her responsibility. The frozen loading docks, the idling trucks, and the furious compliance officers holding on line 3 all belonged to her now. To understand Olivia, you have to understand a lifetime of removed consequences. When she crashed her first car at 17, my father bought her a new one the next week. When she dropped out of her public relations degree, he handed her a director title and a corporate credit card. She never had to untangle a knot. She just bought new rope. She viewed logistics through the same lens. She believed moving freight was a simple transaction. You hire a truck, you put the cargo inside, and you send it down the highway. She did not comprehend the intricate web of Department of Transportation regulations, weight distributions, or liability insurance requirements. They kept a company out of federal court. As the morning dragged into the afternoon, the pressure from Apex escalated. Their regional managers demanded tracking numbers for the inaugural shipments. They threatened to trigger penalty clauses for every hour of delay. Olivia panicked. But she masked her panic with unearned confidence. She wanted to prove to our father that she was the visionary he claimed she was. She wanted to show him that she did not need my software, my dispatchers, or my 12 years of meticulous planning to get the job done. She decided to circumvent our internal fleet entirely. If our trucks could not receive their digital route assignments, she would simply hire outside capacity to haul the Apex goods. She bypassed the standard operating procedures. Our company policy required all third-party vendors to undergo a rigorous vetting process. I built that protocol myself. Every outside carrier had to submit proof of premium liability insurance, a clean safety record, and a Federal Operating Authority certificate. The legal department, led by Mitchell, had to review and sign off on every page before a single pallet was loaded onto a stranger's trailer. Olivia did not have time for vetting. Mitchell was already frustrated with the licensing disaster, and she knew he would delay her plan with endless compliance questions. So she circumvented him. Sitting in her corner office, she searched for independent freight brokers willing to take a high-volume load on zero notice. Most reputable carriers laughed at the request. You do not absorb millions of dollars in retail inventory on a Tuesday afternoon without a digital manifest. But desperate people attract predatory solutions. Olivia found a third-party logistics provider called Silverback Transit. They promised immediate capacity. They claimed they could have 30 empty trailers at the Davis Freight loading docks within 2 hours. They did not ask for a digital routing matrix. They did not ask for optimized load sequences. They just offered a flat rate that seemed miraculously low to a woman who did not know the market value of hauling premium electronics. Olivia viewed it as a triumph. She drafted a manual side agreement, printed it on corporate letterhead, and signed it with her expensive fountain pen. She committed Davis Freight to a binding partnership with Silverback. She did not send the document to Mitchell. She did not check the federal safety databases. She just wanted the trucks to roll, so she could walk into our father's office and announce that she had saved the day. While Olivia was playing executive roulette, I was sitting on my living room couch drinking herbal tea and reading a novel. My phone was still on Do Not Disturb, but I had customized my settings. While I blocked the executive suite and human resources, I left my lines open for the people who actually mattered. The warehouse managers, the dock supervisors, the dispatchers who had worked beside me in the trenches for over a decade. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone vibrated. It was a text message from Marcus. He was the senior dock manager at our primary Dallas sorting facility. He was a man who wore steel-toed boots, carried a battered clipboard, and missed nothing. The message was brief. Just had 30 rigs pull into the yard, non-company trucks. The new boss is bypassing the system and loading the Apex freight onto blind trailers. Name on the cab doors is Silverback Transit. Thought you should know. I stared at the screen. The novel I was reading slipped from my lap. Daniel was sitting across the room, reviewing a case file. He noticed the shift in my posture. He lowered his reading glasses. "What did they do?" he asked quietly. "Olivia just signed a manual carriage deal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She gave the Apex inventory to Silverback Transit." Daniel frowned. He did not know the freight industry the way I did, but he recognized the tone of my voice. "Who is Silverback?" I set my phone on the coffee table. A cold chill ran down my spine, followed instantly by a wave of disbelief. I did not need to run a background check on Silverback. Anyone who had spent more than a year in Texas logistics knew their reputation. "They are a ghost fleet," I explained. "They buy outdated rigs at auction, trucks with bald tires, failing brakes, and faulty refrigeration units. They hire drivers who cannot pass standard background checks. They run dual logbooks to bypass federal sleep requirements." Daniel closed his case file. The gravity of the situation was settling over the room. "How are they still operating?" "They hide behind shell companies. Every time they get hit with a safety violation, they dissolve the LLC and rebrand. But the worst part is their liability coverage. They run bare-bones policies. If one of their drivers causes a wreck, they bankrupt the shell company and leave the primary broker holding the bag. I permanently blacklisted them from our vendor network 4 years ago. My sister, in her desperation to wear the crown, had just handed $80 million of high-end uninsured electronics to a company notorious for highway disasters. She had signed the manual contract without legal review. By doing so, she had formally tied Davis Freight to whatever destruction Silverback was about to cause. I leaned back against the couch cushions. The realization was profound. I had spent the last 3 days wondering how I would dismantle the false empire my father had built for her. I thought I would have to endure months of legal posturing. I thought I would have to slowly bleed them through arbitration. I was wrong. I did not have to lift a single finger. The trap was fully set. But I did not build it. I did not lay the bait. Olivia had constructed the guillotine herself, eager to prove her brilliance, and she was currently kneeling right beneath the blade. I picked up my phone and typed a quick reply to Marcus. Keep your head down. Document everything. Do not sign any transfer of liability forms. Let her own it. I locked the screen. The Apex freight was rolling down the interstate in the hands of exhausted men driving failing machines. The disaster was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. But the tremor of that manual contract was already sending shockwaves through the corporate structure. The executives at Apex Retail were tracking the delays, and the Davis Freight Board of Directors, a group of silent investors who demanded stability over family drama, were beginning to ask questions about the sudden disruption in their supply chain. My father was about to discover that hiding behind a fake visionary does not work when the shareholders demand real answers. The boardroom doors were about to close, and a reckoning was gathering in the shadows. 48 hours is a lifetime in the freight industry. Every passing minute represents unfulfilled invoices, burned diesel, and fading client trust. 2 days had vanished since the gala. During that time, my home remained a sanctuary of quiet routines, while the corporate headquarters of Davis Freight deteriorated into a crucible of unchecked panic. The Silverback transit trucks had rolled out of the Dallas yard, hauling the Apex retail goods into the Texas heat. But logistics is not magic, it is mathematics. You cannot throw 30 rogue, unvetted drivers at a highly optimized supply chain and expect them to hit their targeted delivery windows. The timing was already bleeding. Apex executives were monitoring the transit metrics. They saw the delays accumulating. They demanded answers. That pressure flowed downstream, triggering an emergency session of the Davis Freight Board of Directors on Thursday morning. The boardroom was located on the top floor of our corporate building. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the highway exchange, a visual reminder of the empire generating their wealth. The directors were a collection of private equity representatives, retired logistics barons, and financial auditors. They did not care about my father's legacy. They did not care about the name painted on the side of the trailers. They cared about risk mitigation and quarterly dividends. And right now, their $80 million golden goose was flashing warning signs. My father stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table. I was not in the room, but I knew exactly how he presented himself. He wore his navy pinstripe suit. He braced his hands on the leather chair, leaning forward to project dominance. He knew he was standing on fragile ground, so he utilized the only strategy he had left. He spun a fabricated narrative. He looked at the directors and claimed the operational blackout was simply a planned software migration. He stated that the legacy systems were being upgraded to handle the new Apex volume. When questioned about the friction and the delays, he pivoted smoothly. He laid the blame entirely on me. He framed my departure not as a forced exit, but as a hostile abandonment. He told the board that I was a disgruntled former employee attempting to extort the company. He painted a picture of a jealous sibling holding the technical infrastructure hostage because I could not handle sharing the spotlight. Beside him, Olivia sat in silence, nodding with practiced sorrow, playing the role of the steady, resilient new executive, guiding them through a manufactured storm. It was a masterful performance. My father was a charismatic storyteller. He managed to calm the room, promising that the transition was under control, and the third-party vendor solution was a brilliant temporary bridge to keep the freight moving. Most of the men in that room swallowed the lie. But there was one person sitting at the far end of the table who did not buy a single word. Patricia Sterling was 64 years old. She was the former chief financial officer of a multinational petrochemical firm and the only woman on the Davis Freight board. She was a woman carved from granite. Patricia did not tolerate theatrics. She survived 40 years in male-dominated industries by dissecting balance sheets and searching for the rot hidden underneath corporate smiles. More importantly, Patricia was my mentor. When I was 26, struggling to implement the first iteration of my safety protocols, Patricia invited me to lunch. She did not offer me warm maternal comfort. She offered me strategy. She taught me how to read a room, how to leverage data over emotion, and how to never apologize for being the smartest person at the table. She knew my work ethic. She knew the depth of my technical expertise. Listening to Richard weave a tale of my supposed extortion, Patricia remained silent. She did not raise her hand. She did not object. She knew arguing with a narcissist in public only entrenched their defensive position. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and waited for the meeting to conclude. As the directors packed their briefcases, Patricia approached Mitchell, the general counsel. She requested the raw documentation regarding the new third-party vendor. She invoked her authority as a board member, conducting fiduciary oversight. Mitchell, already exhausted and legally cornered, handed over the physical file containing the Silverback Transit agreement. 30 minutes later, I was sitting at my home desk. My workspace was designed for efficiency. Dual monitors, a mechanical keyboard, a pristine glass surface. My phone was resting on its charging pad when a new email notification chimed on my personal laptop. The sender was a secure encrypted address I recognized immediately. Patricia. The subject line contained 4 words: "Review these files immediately." I opened the message. There was no greeting. There was no conversational pleasantry. The body of the email simply contained 2 PDF attachments. I clicked the first document. It was a digital scan of the official board meeting minutes. I read through the transcribed notes, scanning the cold, sterile text. I watched my father's lies leap off the page. I saw the exact phrasing he used to assassinate my character: extortion, sabotage, disgruntled. I felt a brief, hollow ache in my chest, a final mourning for the father I wished I had. Then the feeling evaporated, replaced by the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing for an operation. I opened the second attachment. It was the manual contract Olivia had signed with Silverback Transit. The scan was crooked, indicating Patricia had copied it in a hurry. I zoomed in on the signature line. Olivia's looping, stylized handwriting sat right next to the stamp of a freight broker I knew belonged behind bars. By forwarding these documents, Patricia had just committed an act of corporate mutiny. She had crossed the invisible line, choosing competence over the old boys club. She gave me eyes inside the fortress. I was no longer an exiled outsider guessing at their maneuvers. I was watching their chess pieces move in real time. I leaned forward, pulling my keyboard closer. I split my screens. On the left monitor, I kept the Silverback contract open. On the right, I launched a series of federal transportation databases, insurance verification portals, and safety rating indices. My sister had signed a legal document committing Davis Freight to a ghost fleet. My father had lied to a board of directors to cover up the mess. They thought they had survived the initial shockwave. They thought the manual workaround was going to keep the apex executives at bay. They did not realize that a contract is a living, breathing liability. I began compiling a digital dossier. I created a new folder on my encrypted hard drive. I named it the Meridian file. I started pulling the public records for every Silverback truck currently hauling our cargo. I traced their shell companies. I downloaded their lapsed insurance certificates. I arranged the facts methodically, row by row, cell by cell. I was not doing this to send a warning. I was not doing this to help them avoid the incoming disaster. I was preparing the exact documentation I would need when the house of cards finally collapsed. Because looking at the fine print of the document Olivia had blindly signed, I realized the trap was far deeper than just hiring a bad vendor. She had not just made a poor logistical choice, she had fundamentally violated the core requirements of the largest client in our history. And all I had to do was cross-reference her signature against the Master Apex agreement to find the fatal flaw that would tear their entire empire apart. I sat in my home office and watched the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my hardwood floor. The transition from defense to offense is not a loud event. It happens in the quiet moments, when you stop reacting to the attacks and start evaluating the battlefield. My father and my sister were fighting a war of perception. They were scrambling to keep up appearances in the boardroom. I was fighting a war of attrition, and I possessed the only weapon that mattered in corporate America: data. I focused my attention on the right monitor. The manual contract Olivia had signed with Silverback Transit was displayed in high resolution. Patricia had scanned it hastily, but the text was legible. I scrolled down to the vendor identification section. Every commercial trucking company operating in the United States is required to list their Department of Transportation registration number on their official documents. It is a unique identifier, a digital footprint that tracks their safety record, their fleet size, and their legal standing. Silverback had provided a 7-digit number. I copied the digits. On my left monitor, I opened the portal for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. This is the government database that governs highway transport. It is not a system you can charm. It does not care about your last name, your custom suit, or your public relations title. It only registers facts. I pasted the Silverback identification number into the search bar and pressed Enter. The screen populated with the carrier profile. The text was stark. I did not need to dig deep to find the rot. It was displayed in bold red letters at the top of the compliance summary. Operating status, inactive. I clicked the Insurance tab. Commercial freight brokers hauling high-value electronics are required to carry multi-million-dollar liability policies to protect the cargo against theft damage and catastrophic accidents. Silverback Transit did not hold a premium policy. They did not hold a policy at all. The database indicated their primary liability coverage had lapsed 90 days ago due to non-payment. My sister had handed $80 million of retail inventory to a fleet of trucks operating illegally on federal highways. I kept scrolling, digging into the safety violation history. The database revealed an active investigation by the Department of Labor. Silverback was notorious for pushing their drivers beyond the legal hours of service limits. They altered logbooks. They forced exhausted men to drive cross-country without mandatory rest periods. It was a ticking time bomb of fatigue and mechanical failure. I took a screenshot of the insurance lapse. I took another screenshot of the federal labor investigation. I saved both images to the secure folder on my desktop. Growing up, I watched Olivia navigate her responsibilities with a terrifying lack of depth. If a high school research paper was due, she paid someone else to write it, or she charmed a teacher into granting an extension. In college, she memorized just enough vocabulary to pass her marketing exams without ever understanding the core concepts. My father rewarded this behavior. He called her resourceful. He praised her ability to delegate. He never understood that delegating without comprehension is just another form of negligence. You can bluff your way through a luncheon. You cannot bluff your way through a federal compliance audit. I minimized the database and opened my local encrypted drive. I navigated to my archived project files. I bypassed the standard operational templates and opened a folder labeled Apex Retail. Inside that folder was the Master Service Agreement. It was a document spanning 140 pages. I knew every sentence in that document because I had drafted it alongside the Apex legal team over 14 grueling months. We debated liability thresholds over late-night conference calls. We scrutinized indemnity clauses until my vision blurred. I built that contract to be an impenetrable fortress for Davis Freight. I pressed a keyboard shortcut to open the search function. I typed Clause 4.2. The screen jumped to page 68, Subcontractor Liability and Vetting Protocols. The language was uncompromising. The clause strictly mandated that any and all third-party vendors utilized by Davis Freight must hold and maintain premium liability insurance. Furthermore, it required a verified safety rating of satisfactory or higher from the federal transport authorities. I read the words again, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction wash over me. By signing the side deal with Silverback Transit, Olivia had not merely made a poor vendor selection, she had triggered a terminal breach of the Master Apex contract. In corporate law, a material breach of this magnitude grants the client the immediate right to void the agreement without penalty. It also exposes the logistics provider to crippling financial damages. If a single Apex shipment was damaged, lost, or delayed while in the custody of an uninsured vendor, Davis Freight would be held entirely responsible for the retail value of the cargo. My father thought I was sulking in the suburbs. He thought my absence was a temporary inconvenience. He had no idea his newly appointed chief executive officer had just signed a death warrant for the family legacy. I opened a blank presentation file. It was time to format the execution. I work best when I am organizing chaos into undeniable truths. I created a timeline. I started with the timestamp of my resignation. I logged the automated deactivation of the routing software. Next, I imported the scan of Olivia's manual contract, highlighting her signature and the timestamp of the agreement. Below her signature, I placed the screenshots from the Federal Safety Database, the lapsed insurance, the inactive operating status, the labor investigation. The red text stood out sharply against the pristine white background of the report. Finally, I copied the text of Clause 4.2 from the Apex Master Agreement. I pasted it at the bottom of the page, bolding the requirement for premium liability coverage. I reviewed the document. It was a flawless, indisputable record of gross fiduciary negligence. It was the kind of report a forensic auditor dreams of discovering. It left no room for spin, no margin for emotional manipulation, and no possibility of denial. I exported the presentation as a secured PDF. I named the file the Meridian Audit. I saved it to the center of my desktop screen. I did not open my email client. I did not attach the PDF. I did not send it to Mitchell, the general counsel, or to Patricia, the board member, who had given me the ammunition. In the art of corporate warfare, firing your weapon too early gives your opponent time to seek cover. If I sent the dossier now, my father would have a window of opportunity. He would call his lawyers, attempt to nullify the Silverback contract, and try to contain the damage before the client found out. He would find a way to shift the blame to a low-level dispatch clerk. He would survive. I did not want him to survive. I wanted the old regime to burn down to the studs so something new could be built on the foundation. So I took my hand off the mouse. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the PDF icon resting on my screen. The Apex Retail Compliance team operated with ruthless efficiency. I knew their protocols because I had helped design the reporting structures. Every new vendor route was subject to a mandatory 72-hour audit. They would review the electronic logging devices of the trucks carrying their goods. They would check the insurance certificates of the drivers hauling their cargo. They were going to discover the lapsed insurance on their own. They were going to read the name Silverback Transit on the freight bills. They were going to realize they had entrusted $80 million of inventory to a ghost fleet. I looked at the clock on my wall. The 72-hour window was already closing. The Apex auditors were undoubtedly pulling the first wave of tracking data. The friction at the loading docks was about to escalate into a full-scale corporate emergency. I locked my computer screen. I walked into the kitchen to pour another cup of tea. The silence in my house remained unbroken, but I knew the silence at Davis Freight was about to shatter. The storm was no longer gathering. It was making landfall, and very soon the people who told me I was nothing but a worker bee were going to pick up their phones and dial my number. 72 hours. In the high-stakes environment of commercial freight, 3 days is the maximum lifespan of a fabricated narrative. You can lie to a board of directors, you can lie to your employees, but you cannot lie to a logistics algorithm, and you certainly cannot lie to a compliance auditor at a retail giant. The Apex Retail Corporate Headquarters operates with the precision of a scalpel. Their supply chain division does not care about family legacies or corner office politics. They care about risk exposure. Every new vendor integrated into their network undergoes a mandatory compliance sweep at the end of the 3rd day. It is an automated fail-safe designed to catch the exact kind of incompetence my sister had just authorized. At 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, an Apex compliance officer sat in a cubicle in downtown Dallas. He pulled the digital telemetry data for the inaugural shipments. He expected to see the standard Davis Freight carrier profiles. Instead, the screen populated with unfamiliar routing tags. He ran the Department of Transportation registration numbers printed on the bills of lading. The federal database returned the same red text I had seen 24 hours earlier. Operating status, inactive. Liability insurance, lapsed. Federal labor investigation, pending. The auditor did not call my father to ask for an explanation. Corporate giants do not ask questions when they discover an uninsured rogue fleet carrying $80 million of their premium inventory. They execute protocols. The auditor flagged the manifest and sent it directly to the Apex Legal Department. The response was immediate, clinical, and devastating. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the fax machine inside the executive suite at Davis Freight printed a single binding document. It was not a warning. It was a formal notice of suspension. The letter cited a material breach of Clause 4.2. The $80 million contract was frozen effective immediately. All pending loads were canceled. All delivered goods were subject to a rigorous secondary inspection, the cost of which would be billed directly to my father. I was not in the room when Mitchell, the general counsel, handed that paper to Richard Davis, but I know the architecture of a corporate panic. The oxygen leaves the room. The grand illusions of power dissolve, leaving nothing but the cold, hard math of a catastrophic failure. My father realized in that fraction of a second that his visionary daughter had just bankrupted his legacy. Back in my living room, the late afternoon sun was filtering through the blinds. Daniel and I were sitting on the couch. I held a warm mug of Earl Grey tea. A documentary about deep-sea ocean currents played softly on the television. My phone was resting on the glass coffee table. The screen had been dark for hours. Then it lit up. The vibration buzzed against the glass, a sharp, angry sound. I did not reach for it. I watched the caller identification flash my father's name. The call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the screen illuminated again. Then again. The digital dam had broken. The 97 missed calls began. The notifications stacked on top of each other, an endless waterfall of desperation. Calls from my father, calls from Olivia, calls from the main dispatch line. The phone vibrated so intensely it began to inch across the smooth surface of the coffee table. Daniel reached over, placed a coaster in front of the device to stop it from sliding, and leaned back into the cushions. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. We did not need to speak. We both knew the Apex audit had detonated. After 20 minutes of relentless calling, the voicemails started populating. The Do Not Disturb feature trapped their panic in digital recordings, neatly organizing their descent into chaos. I set my tea down, picked up the phone, and tapped the speaker icon. The first voicemail from my father was recorded at 4:45. He was trying to maintain his authority, attempting to command the tide to stop rising. His voice was rigid, filled with the arrogant timbre he used to negotiate hostile buyouts. He demanded I answer the phone. He ordered me to log into the servers and fix the vendor routing anomaly. He told me the Apex compliance team was misinterpreting a clerical error, and it was my job as the systems architect to correct their misunderstanding. He ended the message by stating I had 10 minutes to call him back before he involved the authorities. I deleted the message. The second voicemail arrived 15 minutes later. The rigid authority had fractured. The cold reality of the suspension notice had finally penetrated his ego. The tone shifted from a command to a frantic negotiation. He offered me money. He promised a substantial performance bonus if I would just drive to the terminal and untangle the mess Olivia had created. He suggested we could draft a new employment contract, giving me the vice president title back, along with a dedicated parking space. He was bargaining with scraps, trying to purchase my 12 years of intellectual property with the title he had already proven was worthless. I deleted that message too. The third voicemail from Richard Davis was something I had never heard in my 34 years of life. My father, the man who built an empire on stoicism and intimidation, was weeping. The audio was clear. I could hear his breath catching in his throat. The background noise of the executive suite was gone. He sounded like he was hiding inside a supply closet, shielding his breakdown from the employees he was supposed to lead. He begged me to pick up. He said the board of directors was drafting a resolution to strip his equity. He sobbed, telling me he was going to lose the building, the trucks, the house, everything. He pleaded with me to save the family. I watched the audio waveform ripple across the screen. I felt a strange, detached pity for him. He had spent his entire life valuing the wrong daughter, and now he was drowning in the consequences of his own selection. I pressed the trash icon. The weeping vanished. The final voicemail was from Olivia. If my father was broken, my sister was dangerous. Her recording was a shrill, hysterical barrage of victimhood. She did not apologize for signing the Silverback contract. She did not acknowledge her lack of vetting. Instead, she blamed the entire collapse on me. She screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with fury. She accused me of setting her up. She claimed I deliberately left the routing matrix complicated so she would fail. She said I was a jealous, bitter woman who could not stand to see her succeed. She ended the recording by hyperventilating, shouting that I had ruined her life and destroyed her future. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in my living room. The The documentary on the television showed a shark gliding through dark water, silent and efficient. I looked at the phone. 4 voicemails. 4 stages of toxic realization. I want to pause the narrative right here and talk directly to you. If you are listening to this and you have ever walked away from a toxic dynamic, you know the exact script I just played. When toxic people lose control over you, their strategy is always predictable. First, they demand your compliance. Second, they try to bribe you with the bare minimum of respect. Third, they weaponize their own suffering, begging you to save them from the mess they created. And finally, when none of that works, they rewrite the history and blame you for their failure. Manufactured guilt is the heaviest chain a family can wrap around your neck. They condition you to believe that their survival depends on your sacrifice. But a boundary is not a punishment. It is an act of self-preservation. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. If you have ever had to delete a voicemail designed to drag you back into the dark, drop a comment below. Your resilience matters, and someone else reading your story might need to borrow your strength today. I tapped the screen one final time and deleted Olivia's hysterical accusations. My inbox was clean. The digital ledger was balanced. Daniel picked up our empty mugs and carried them into the kitchen. He understood that my silence was not hesitation. It was the calm processing of a victory that required no celebration. The 97 missed calls were proof that the fortress was falling, but I knew the psychology of the people I was dealing with. They could not accept a digital rejection. A phone call can be ignored. A text message can be deleted. When narcissists realize they can no longer reach you through a screen, their desperation forces them into the physical world. They needed a target for their rage. They needed a physical confrontation to project their failure onto someone else. I stood up and walked toward the front window of my living room. I looked out at our quiet suburban street, the manicured lawns, the empty sidewalks, the calm safety of a life I had built with my own hands. I reached out and checked the deadbolt on the heavy oak door. My phone had stopped vibrating. The silence was absolute. But it was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Because if my father and sister could not command me through a speakerphone, there was only one remaining tactical move. They were going to leave the corporate headquarters, get into their luxury vehicles, and drive straight to my house. The confrontation was coming to my front porch. The late afternoon shadows stretched across the manicured lawns of my suburban neighborhood. I stood by the front window of my living room watching the quiet street. A black luxury sedan turned the corner at an unsafe speed, its tires squealing against the asphalt. Right behind it, a white company-leased SUV rode the bumper. They parked haphazardly, their tires resting over the concrete curb. Richard Davis stepped out of the sedan. He was no longer the polished executive from the gala. His silk tie was loosened, hanging like a broken leash around his neck. His suit jacket was wrinkled, and his shoulders carried a heavy, defeated slump. Olivia stumbled out of the SUV a second later. Her designer dress looked unkempt and her makeup was visibly smeared. Panic is a potent solvent. It strips away the veneer of untouchable wealth and leaves only raw, unfiltered fear. They marched up my concrete driveway. Daniel moved to stand beside me, his presence a silent wall of support. He asked quietly if I wanted him to handle the situation. I shook my head. This was my threshold. I needed to be the one to close this chapter. I walked into the foyer. I did not unlock the entryway immediately. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to their heavy footsteps climb the 3 brick steps to my porch. My father raised his fist to pound on the wood. Before his knuckles could strike, I turned the handle and pulled the door open. I stood in the frame, blocking the entrance. The warm evening air rushed into the house, bringing the scent of engine heat and desperation. My father started talking before the door was fully open. He reverted to his default setting of unearned authority. He told me to pack my laptop, get in his car, and fix the Apex blockade immediately. He spoke with the cadence of a general barking orders to a subordinate. He claimed we were wasting time and that he would overlook my insubordination if I acted without hesitation. He was trying to bend reality, pretending the power dynamic had not fundamentally shifted. He expected me to fall back into line, conditioned by a lifetime of obedience. I did not respond. I just looked at his flushed face, analyzing his desperate posture. When my silence stretched, Olivia pushed past him. The arrogant woman who accepted the chief executive officer title 3 days ago was gone. In her place stood a terrified child. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She reached out, attempting to grab my arm. I stepped back, keeping the distance sterile and formal. She began sobbing, a frantic, high-pitched sound. She confessed she had spoken to an outside attorney that afternoon. The lawyer informed her that signing a manual freight agreement with an uninsured, unvetted carrier without corporate authorization constituted severe negligence, bordering on commercial fraud. She wailed that she was going to federal prison. She blamed the legal department for not warning her. She blamed the freight brokers for deceiving her. She looked at me with wide, bloodshot eyes and begged me to rewrite the software logs. She wanted me to manipulate the routing matrix to make the Silverback anomaly look like a computer glitch. She was asking me to commit a felony to cover her profound incompetence. My father realized his commands were ineffective. He saw my expression remain stoic, unmoved by Olivia's theatrical breakdown. He switched tactics, utilizing the weapon he had honed for decades: patriarchal guilt. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of wounded sorrow. He talked about the sacrifices he made to build Davis Freight. He recounted the early years, claiming he missed my childhood milestones only to put food on our table. He invoked the concept of familial loyalty. He told me that blood is thicker than legal contracts. He looked at my house, at Daniel standing quietly in the hallway behind me, and told me I was turning my back on my own legacy. He demanded I save the family from ruin, insisting that my refusal would destroy everything he had built for our future. If he had tried that guilt trip a year ago, it might have worked. I might have internalized the blame, believing my worth was tied to my utility. But standing on my porch, listening to a man try to manipulate me into saving the sister he chose over me, I felt nothing but a hollow clarity. Their crisis was not my burden. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. Emotional outbursts are the currency of the powerless. I reached over to the console table beside the door. Resting next to a decorative ceramic bowl was a crisp white envelope. My attorney had delivered it by courier 2 hours earlier, anticipating this exact escalation. I held the envelope out. Richard looked at it, confused by the gesture. He hesitated, then took it from my hand. I explained the contents with a steady, clinical rhythm. I told him it was a formal cease and desist order. It legally prohibited him, Olivia, and any representative of Davis Freight from contacting me by phone, email, or physical proximity. I informed him that appearing on my property again would result in an immediate trespassing charge. I stated that any future communication regarding my intellectual property or any requests for technical assistance must be routed exclusively through my legal counsel. My father stared at the document. The color drained from his face as his eyes scanned the legal letterhead. He finally understood the gravity of the boundary I had drawn. The disposable worker bee had built a fortress, and he was permanently locked outside. I turned my attention to my sister. She was still weeping, wiping ruined mascara from her cheeks, waiting for a pardon I would never grant. I looked her directly in the eyes. I kept my voice low, ensuring she heard every single syllable over her own sobbing. "You wanted the crown," I said. "Wear it." I stepped back inside my house. I pulled the heavy oak door shut. I did not wait for a response. I did not listen to the protests bubbling in my father's throat. I turned the deadbolt. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed in the foyer, a final punctuation mark on 12 years of exploitation. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder. We walked back to the living room in silence. I did not look out the window to watch them leave. Their presence on my lawn was irrelevant. The emotional tether had been severed. But closing my front door did not stop the corporate machinery from grinding forward. While my father and sister were standing on my porch holding a legal warning they could not ignore, the executives at Apex Retail were convening their own emergency session. The retail giant had grown tired of the delays, the excuses, and the rogue trucks hauling their valuable inventory across the state. They were preparing to elevate the conflict beyond a local supply chain disruption. They were drafting an ultimatum that would force Richard Davis to travel to their Dallas headquarters and face the architects of his demise. The true corporate reckoning was hours away. Monday morning arrived with a clear blue sky over Texas. My weekend had been a quiet sanctuary of gardening and reading, insulated by the legal boundary I drew on my front porch. For my father, those 48 hours were a slow descent into corporate purgatory. Apex Retail did not operate on a standard business schedule. Their supply chain division ran around the clock, evaluating efficiency down to the microsecond. When their compliance officers suspended the Davis Freight contract on Friday afternoon, they did not wait for an apology. They spent the weekend auditing the damage. By Monday morning, they were ready to deliver their verdict. At 8 o'clock, Richard Davis received a formal summons to the Apex Retail corporate headquarters in downtown Dallas. It was not an invitation for a casual lunch to smooth over ruffled feathers. It was a mandatory appearance. The Apex building is a monolith of dark glass and steel, a stark contrast to the faded brick of the Davis Freight terminal. Inside, the executive floors are designed to intimidate. The corridors are silent, lined with abstract art and frosted glass partitions. My father walked into Conference Room B, a sprawling space dominated by a white marble table. Waiting for him was Carter Hayes, the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain Logistics for Apex Retail. Carter was 45 years old, a former military officer who viewed transportation networks as tactical operations. He did not care about legacy charm or firm handshakes. He cared about data. He was the executive I spent 14 months negotiating with to secure the $80 million deal. He knew my work ethic. He knew the depth of my technical acumen. Richard sat down, attempting to project confidence. He wore his finest suit, ready to deploy his usual array of excuses. He opened his mouth to explain the software glitch and the temporary vendor solution. Carter raised a single hand, stopping my father before he could finish his first sentence. Carter slid a black binder across the marble table. Inside was a comprehensive audit of the Silverback Transit fleet. It detailed the lapsed insurance, the federal labor investigations, and the abysmal safety ratings. Carter did not yell. He spoke with the quiet, chilling rhythm of a surgeon identifying a terminal disease. He informed Richard that handing premium retail inventory to a ghost fleet was not a clerical error. It was gross fiduciary negligence. He stated that the breach of Clause 4.2 was catastrophic and irreversible under current management. My father tried to salvage the situation. He promised to fire Silverback immediately. He assured Carter that Olivia, his visionary new executive, was restructuring the vendor vetting process as they spoke. He tried to sell a narrative of swift, decisive leadership. Carter leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He told my father he did not care about Olivia. He stated very plainly that he knew exactly who built the Davis Freight routing matrix. He knew who drafted the service agreement. He knew that the only reason Apex ever signed the contract in the first place was because Grace Davis had designed a flawless logistical infrastructure. Then Carter delivered the ultimatum. Apex Retail would not cancel the $80 million contract outright, but the suspension would remain in effect. They offered a single condition for reinstatement. The deal would only move forward if Grace Davis was legally reinstated as the head of operations, possessing full executive control over the entire Davis Freight network. Carter stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room. He left my father sitting alone at the marble table, staring at the black binder. The demand was a lethal blow to Richard's ego. He had spent his entire life viewing me as a background utility, a worker bee designed to support his golden child. Now, the largest client in the history of his business was telling him that the worker bee was the only asset they valued. The patriarch was obsolete. The visionary was a liability. But a narcissist rarely surrenders on the first attempt. They try to find a loophole. They try to purchase compliance without conceding true power. At noon on Monday, I was sitting in the polished conference room of my attorney, Jonathan. Jonathan was a pragmatic litigator who specialized in corporate contract disputes. He wore muted suits and spoke in measured, deliberate sentences. He did not traffic in emotion. He trafficked in leverage. His assistant brought in a printed document that had just arrived via encrypted email from the Davis Freight legal department. Jonathan read it, an amused expression flickering across his face. He slid the paper across the desk to me. It was a settlement offer drafted by Mitchell, authorized by my father. Richard was attempting to swallow his pride, but he was still choking on his own arrogance. The document was framed as an olive branch, a generous offer to welcome me back to the family fold. The terms outlined a signing bonus of $200,000, paid in quarterly installments. It guaranteed the restoration of my previous title, Vice President of Operations. It also included a dedicated parking space near the executive entrance and a company-leased vehicle. In exchange, I was required to reactivate the routing software, sign a permanent, unrestricted licensing agreement, granting Davis Freight full ownership of the intellectual property, and assume immediate control of the Apex retail crisis. I read the offer twice. The silence in Jonathan's office was heavy. Then I laughed. It was not a bitter laugh, nor a vindictive one. It was the genuine amusement of a woman watching a drowning man try to sell her a glass of water. My father still believed he was holding the winning hand. He thought $200,000 was a sum large enough to blind me to the reality of the situation. He was offering me my old job back, the very same position he had publicly stripped from me in front of 200 industry executives. He wanted me to save his company, surrender my software, and step back into the shadow of his authority. He believed a title and a car would heal a lifetime of disrespect. "He does not understand the board," Jonathan said, tapping a silver pen against his legal pad. "He thinks this is a negotiation. He thinks I want a seat at his table," I replied, setting the document down. I looked at the signature line, where my father had already penned his name, anticipating my eager acceptance. The sheer audacity was staggering. He was offering me a fraction of the value my software generated in a single quarter, expecting me to bail out the sister who currently held the chief executive title. "What is your counteroffer?" Jonathan asked, preparing to draft a response. "I do not have a counteroffer," I said. "Reject it. Send a single sentence confirming receipt and declining all terms. Do not leave room for a follow-up proposal." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, respecting the cold efficiency of the decision. He turned to his computer and began typing the rejection. I leaned back in the leather chair, looking out the window at the Dallas skyline. The glass towers gleamed in the afternoon sun. I was not playing a game for a performance bonus. I was not maneuvering to reclaim a vice president title underneath a man who would always view me as subordinate. I was watching the old regime fracture under the weight of its own incompetence. Accepting a buyout would mean propping up a corrupt structure. I wanted the structure to collapse. I wanted the foundation cleared. You cannot build a modern empire on rotten wood. My father would receive Jonathan's rejection within the hour. He would realize that his money could not buy his salvation. He would realize that Apex Retail was not going to bend, and his estranged daughter was not going to rescue him. He and Olivia were out of options. They were stranded in the executive suite, holding the steering wheel of a vehicle that had no engine. But the true disaster was not happening in a boardroom. The real catastrophe was unfolding on the hot asphalt of the Texas interstate system. While Richard was trying to negotiate his Survival the Manual side agreement, Olivia, signed with Silverback Transit, was reaching its inevitable, tragic conclusion. You cannot put exhausted men behind the wheels of failing machines and expect the laws of physics to look the other way. The Ghost Fleet was running on borrowed time, hauling millions of dollars in uninsured electronics. The tension was snapping, the friction was sparking, and far outside the city limits, a weary driver hauling a fully loaded trailer was approaching a sharp curve, carrying the final nail for the coffin of Davis Freight. Tuesday morning arrived with a stillness that felt deceptive. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the read receipts from my attorney's email the previous afternoon. The rejection of the buyout offer had been delivered and opened. My father knew his money was no longer valid currency, but the quiet in my house was just a localized weather pattern. Out on the Texas highway system, a severe storm was already making landfall. You can spin a narrative in a boardroom. You can lie to a general counsel. You can even lie to a retail giant like Apex if you hide the paperwork well enough. But you cannot lie to the laws of physics. Commercial freight operates on a razor-thin margin of error. A standard tractor-trailer combination weighs up to 80,000 pounds when fully loaded. It requires pristine brakes, properly inflated tires, and a driver who possesses the cognitive awareness to react to shifting traffic patterns in fractions of a second. The federal government mandates strict hours of service for a reason. Fatigue is a silent, predictable killer on the interstate. Silverback Transit did not care about fatigue. They cared about turning a profit on cut-rate contracts. At 5:30 in the morning, a Silverback rig was traveling south on Interstate 35 just outside the Austin city limits. The truck was a 20-year-old model with a deferred maintenance schedule. The driver had been behind the wheel for 14 hours, operating on a manipulated electronic logbook to bypass federal rest requirements. He was hauling a 53-foot refrigerated trailer packed to the ceiling with premium Apex retail electronics, high-end televisions, premium laptops, and pallet after pallet of smart home devices. The stretch of highway descending into the capital city features a steep, sustained grade. The driver tapped his brakes to manage the descent. The brake pads worn down to the metal indicators overheated and glazed over. The friction disappeared. The 80,000-pound vehicle transformed into an unguided missile. The driver panicked. He jerked the steering wheel to the right, hoping to catch the gravel shoulder and reduce his speed. The sudden shift in momentum caused the top-heavy trailer to sway. The tires lost traction on the morning dew. The entire rig rolled over, sliding across 3 lanes of concrete, tearing through the steel guardrail and plunging down the grassy embankment. The structural integrity of the trailer failed upon impact. The aluminum walls peeled back like a tin can. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Marcus, the dock manager. He did not send a greeting or an explanation. He just sent a web link to a local Austin news affiliate. I set the coffee pot down. I picked up my tablet, carried it to the living room couch, and tapped the link. The screen buffered for a moment before loading a live helicopter broadcast. The news anchor was reporting on a severe traffic delay on southbound Interstate 35, but my eyes were not on the traffic backup. I was staring at the wreckage illuminated by the early morning sun. The white cab of the truck was crushed against a concrete pillar. The driver had survived and was being loaded into an ambulance, a small mercy in an otherwise catastrophic scene. But the true disaster lay scattered across the embankment. Hundreds of crushed cardboard boxes littered the grass. The pristine, recognizable branding of Apex Retail was visible even from the aerial camera angle. Shards of glass from shattered television screens sparkled in the sunlight. Laptops were strewn across the dirt, their chassis bent and ruined. It looked like a retail warehouse had been dropped from the sky. The news anchor continued speaking, identifying the carrier based on the faded logo painted on the wrecked cab. Silverback Transit. I watched the footage with a cold, steady pulse. I did not feel shock. I did not feel surprise. I was watching the inevitable culmination of unearned authority. My sister had demanded the steering wheel of a company she did not understand, and this wreckage was the direct result of her navigation. I paused the video feed and performed a quick mental calculation. I knew the exact inventory manifest for that specific route. I had designed the load distribution software that balanced those pallets. That single trailer was carrying $4.2 million worth of wholesale retail inventory. In the logistics industry, lost cargo is an everyday risk. That is why reputable brokers carry premium liability insurance. If a verified insured carrier wrecks a load, their insurance provider cuts a check to the client replaces the inventory, and the freight broker continues operating. But Olivia had not hired a verified carrier. I opened the digital dossier I had compiled the day before. I navigated to the scan of the manual side agreement my sister had signed. I zoomed in on the liability clause she had blindly accepted to get the trucks moving. The standard Davis Freight contract required all third-party vendors to indemnify us against any loss. Olivia did not use the standard contract. She used a boilerplate agreement provided by Silverback. She did not ask the legal department to review it. She just signed on the dotted line. That specific piece of paper contained a comprehensive waiver of liability. It stated that Silverback Transit assumed zero financial responsibility for cargo damage in the event of an accident. Furthermore, because Silverback possessed no active insurance policy, there was no underwriter to absorb the cost. By signing that document, Olivia had legally transferred the entire $4.2 million burden directly onto the balance sheet of Davis Freight and Logistics. When we were growing up, Olivia had a habit of breaking things and walking away. When she was 19, she borrowed my father's vintage sports car without permission. She ignored the temperature gauge, overheated the engine, and cracked the block. She left the car on the side of the road and called a ride service to take her home. My father paid the salvage fee, covered the exorbitant repair costs, and handed her the keys to a brand new sedan the following week. She never paid a dollar. She never faced a consequence. She lived in a reality where her mistakes were always subsidized by someone else. She assumed corporate leadership operated on the same principle. She believed that if she made a mistake, the company accounts would simply absorb the impact and our father would smooth over the friction. But corporate finance does not act like an enabling parent. Davis Freight was a high-volume, low-margin business. Our wealth was tied up in physical assets, real estate warehouse leases, and heavy machinery. The actual liquid operating capital, the cash used to pay the dock workers, purchase diesel fuel, and keep the lights on, was carefully managed. A sudden uninsured liability of $4.2 million is a lethal blow to a regional carrier. Apex Retail would demand immediate restitution for the destroyed inventory. They would not accept a payment plan. They would exercise their right to extract the funds directly from the Davis Freight corporate accounts. If my father attempted to pay that invoice, the operating accounts would be drained to zero. The payroll checks scheduled for Friday would bounce. The fuel cards used by the company drivers would be declined at the pumps. The commercial lenders holding the mortgages on the warehouses would immediately freeze the credit lines upon seeing the extreme cash flow deficit. In the span of a single morning, a 29-year-old woman with a vanity title had effectively bankrupted a 30-year-old empire. I closed the newsfeed on my tablet. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my coffee. The satisfaction I felt was profound, but it was not rooted in malice. It was the deep, resonant comfort of watching the universe correct a long-standing imbalance. Gravity had finally caught up to the people who believed they could walk on air. My father and my sister were currently waking up to the same news broadcast. Their phones were undoubtedly ringing. The executives at Apex Retail were preparing their demand letters. The facade of the visionary chief executive officer was dissolving in the face of hard, undeniable debt. But the most dangerous threat to Richard Davis was not the retail client or the local news anchors. It was the group of men and women who held the true power over the corporate charter, the Davis Freight Board of Directors. These were investors who demanded predictable returns. They had listened to my father spin a tale of software glitches and temporary fixes just days prior. They had given him the benefit of the doubt. Now, they were looking at millions of dollars of their own equity, burning on the side of an Austin highway. They were going to request a copy of the contract Olivia signed. They were going to see the gross negligence printed in black and white. And they were going to realize that the chairman of the board had lied to their faces to protect an incompetent child. The boardroom doors were about to lock from the inside. The time for excuses had expired, and the mutiny was ready to begin. When a commercial truck carrying millions of dollars in uninsured inventory rolls over on a Texas highway, the impact is felt far beyond the concrete. The physical wreckage is cleared away by tow trucks and emergency crews within a few hours. The corporate wreckage, however, travels straight upward, bypassing middle management and striking the highest level of executive oversight. I was not inside the Davis Freight headquarters that Tuesday morning. I did not need to be. I understood the architecture of the board of directors, and I knew exactly how they would react to the morning news broadcast. Private equity investors and retired logistics barons do not panic the way my sister panicked. They do not weep over voicemails. When their capital is threatened, they operate with the cold mechanical efficiency of a guillotine. Patricia Sterling was the architect of that efficiency. You do not survive 40 years as a female executive in the petrochemical sector by offering second chances to incompetent men. During the oil crash of the 1980s, Patricia earned a reputation for dismantling failing subsidiaries piece by piece, amputating infected corporate limbs to save the host organization. She viewed business through a binary lens. An asset either generated revenue or it generated risk. By 9 o'clock that morning, Richard and Olivia Davis were no longer generating revenue. They were a terminal risk. Patricia bypassed my father entirely. She utilized her authority as a senior board member to contact the corporate secretary, demanding an immediate mandatory emergency session. The remaining directors were summoned. They arrived at the top-floor boardroom carrying briefcases and grim expressions. Richard walked into the room 10 minutes late. He brought Olivia with him. My father attempted to project his traditional aura of command. He wore a dark charcoal suit, his posture rigid, his jaw set tight. He planned to control the narrative just as he had done during the previous meeting. He intended to frame the highway crash as an unfortunate anomaly, a rare statistical failure by a third-party vendor that they were already addressing. He walked toward the head of the heavy mahogany table, ready to take his customary seat. Patricia stood at the opposite end. She did not offer a greeting. She simply looked at my father and pointed to a chair along the side wall, a seat normally reserved for junior analysts taking notes. She informed him that the chairman does not preside over a meeting called to investigate his own fiduciary dereliction. Richard froze. The air in the room grew heavy. He looked at the other directors, expecting them to defend his hierarchy. The men stared back at him with blank, unforgiving faces. Slowly, my father lowered himself into the side chair. Olivia sat next to him, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes fixed on the polished wood floor. Patricia did not waste time with introductory remarks. She opened a manila folder and distributed copies of a single document to every investor at the table. It was the manual contract Olivia had signed with Silverback Transit. Attached to the back were the printed federal safety records and the lapsed insurance certificates I had uncovered. Patricia had taken the exact data points I found and weaponized them for the boardroom. She stood at the head of the table and delivered the financial reality with surgical precision. She stated that the new chief executive officer had bypassed all vetting protocols to hire an illegal ghost fleet. Because of that specific signature, Davis Freight was now 100% liable for the destroyed Apex retail inventory. The debt totaled $4.2 million. Furthermore, Patricia informed the room that Apex Retail had formally suspended their $80 million partnership. The suspension was indefinite, pending a complete change in leadership. The silence that followed her statement was profound. The directors digested the numbers. $4.2 million in immediate liquid debt, $80 million in lost future revenue. The company was not just bleeding, it was effectively bankrupt. Patricia looked directly at my sister. She stated that Olivia Davis had demonstrated a staggering level of gross negligence. Her actions constituted a clear and present danger to the survival of the enterprise. Then Patricia turned her gaze to my father. She addressed Richard Davis, the founder, the patriarch, the man who believed his last name granted him immunity from consequence. She accused him of deliberately misleading the board of directors. She stated that he had installed an unqualified family member into a critical executive role to serve his own ego, and he had actively covered up her catastrophic mistakes. Patricia formally proposed a resolution of no confidence. She moved for a vote to immediately terminate Olivia Davis from all employment at Davis Freight. Simultaneously, she moved to strip Richard Davis of his chairman status and suspend his executive operating authority. The color rushed to my father's face. The shock evaporated, replaced by a volatile, desperate rage. He stood up, kicking his chair back. He slammed his fist against the mahogany table. He pointed a trembling finger at Patricia and began to shout. He relied on the only defense he thought he possessed: equity. He reminded the room that he founded the business. He reminded them that his name was painted on every trailer in the yard. He leaned forward, his voice echoing against the glass windows, and declared that he owned 60% of the voting shares. He told the directors they worked at his pleasure. He threatened to dissolve the board, fire every person in the room, and hire a new oversight committee by the end of the week. He thought his majority percentage made him a king. He thought he was untouchable. Patricia waited for him to finish yelling. She did not raise her voice. She opened a thick, leather-bound book resting on the table. It was the Davis Freight Corporate Charter. I knew that book intimately. Years ago, when we were securing our first round of private equity funding, the institutional investors demanded robust safety mechanisms to protect their minority capital. I sat in the room with our legal counsel while they drafted those protections. I knew the exact trapdoor hidden inside the bylaws. Patricia flipped to Article 7, Section B, the Emergency Fiduciary Breach Clause. She read the text aloud, her words slicing through my father's bluster. The clause explicitly stated that in the event of gross negligence resulting in an immediate threat of corporate insolvency, the board of directors possessed the legal authority to force a leadership change, regardless of shareholder percentage. A unanimous vote by the minority directors could override the majority owner to protect the surviving assets from imminent destruction. My father stared at the leather book. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He had signed that charter a decade ago, eager to take the investor's money, assuming he would never be reckless enough to trigger the penalty. He looked at the men sitting around the table. He searched their faces for a shred of loyalty, a hint of the camaraderie they shared during expensive golf retreats and charity dinners. He found nothing. They were investors measuring a liability, and Richard Davis was the heaviest weight on the ledger. Patricia called for the vote. One by one, the directors raised their hands. The decision was unanimous. Patricia closed the corporate charter. She looked at Olivia, who was now weeping softly into her hands. She informed my sister that her employment was terminated, effective immediately. She instructed Olivia to leave all corporate property, including her phone and keys, on the table. Then she looked at my father. She told Richard he was relieved of his duties. He was no longer permitted to access the executive suite, the dispatch center, or the warehouse floor. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The patriarch was broken. The empire he built to glorify his own image had just locked its gates, leaving him standing on the outside. Patricia picked up a desk phone and dialed the lobby security desk. 10 minutes later, the heavy boardroom doors opened. 2 uniformed security guards stepped inside. The lead guard was a man named Marcus, a retired police officer who had worked the front desk for 8 years. Every morning during my tenure, I would bring Marcus a cup of coffee. I knew the names of his grandchildren. I respected him, and he respected the silent, relentless work I poured into the building. Marcus did not look angry, but his face was stern. He approached my father and sister. He asked them to hand over their security badges. Olivia unclipped her badge with trembling fingers, dropping it onto the mahogany surface. Richard unclasped his lanyard slowly, staring at the plastic card bearing his name and the title of chairman. He set it down next to hers. Marcus escorted them out of the boardroom. They walked down the long, carpeted hallway. They stepped into the elevator. They rode down to the lobby in silence. As they walked through the ground floor atrium, the warehouse staff and administrative assistants paused their work. The employees watched the golden child and the untouchable founder taking the walk of shame, flanked by security. The false idols were falling, and the entire company was watching the descent. Marcus led them to the glass exit doors. He held the door open, waiting for them to step out into the punishing Texas heat. They walked toward their cars, stripped of their power, their dignity, and their future. Back in my quiet suburban home, I received a text message from Patricia. It contained 2 words: vote passed. I set my phone down. The old regime was officially dead. The boardroom had executed the necessary amputation. But the problem with amputating a dying limb is that the patient is still bleeding out. Davis Freight was headless, possessing $4.2 million in immediate debt, 0 operational routing software, and a suspended retail contract. Liquidation was imminent. The vultures were circling. But I was not a vulture. I was the architect, and I knew that when a building is condemned, the prime real estate beneath it can be purchased for a fraction of its true value. My phone rang again. It was not a desperate family member seeking salvation. It was a representative from a premier Dallas private equity firm, ready to discuss the final acquisition. The time for waiting was over. It was time to set the buyout table. 2 weeks is all it takes for a thriving commercial enterprise to turn into a graveyard. 14 days. In the freight industry, momentum is everything. When the trucks stop moving, the cash flow ceases, but the operational costs remain rigid. The commercial lenders holding the mortgages on the warehouses saw the Apex Retail suspension and reacted with immediate clinical self-preservation. They froze the credit lines. The payroll accounts dried up. The dispatchers, the dock workers, and the drivers began packing their personal belongings and filing for unemployment. I returned to the Davis Freight headquarters on a Wednesday morning. The Texas heat was already radiating off the asphalt in the employee parking lot. The yard, usually a chaotic ballet of roaring diesel engines and backing trailers, was entirely silent. Row upon row of white cabs sat parked in perfect dormant lines. I did not drive my personal car. I arrived in the back of a black car service, accompanied by 2 men who specialized in corporate extraction. Sitting to my right was Jonathan, my attorney. Sitting to my left was Preston Cole, a senior managing partner at Vanguard Capital. Vanguard was a premier private equity firm based in Austin, known for identifying distressed logistical assets and acquiring them before the bankruptcy courts could carve them up. I had spent the last 14 days in conference rooms with Preston, mapping out the precise architecture of a hostile asset acquisition. I stepped out of the vehicle. I wore a tailored slate suit and sensible heels. For 12 years, I walked through those front doors, carrying a clipboard, wearing sensible slacks, looking like a woman ready to put out fires. Today, I looked like the woman who owned the matches. We walked through the glass entry doors. The lobby was dim, the receptionist's desk was empty. The veteran security guard standing near the turnstiles saw me approach. He did not ask for my identification. He simply nodded, swiped his master key card, and let the glass barrier slide open. He knew the old regime was dead, and he recognized the posture of the person arriving to claim the remains. We took the elevator to the executive floor. The ride was quiet, save for the mechanical hum of the cables. Jonathan adjusted his briefcase. Preston checked his watch. I watched the floor indicator numbers climb, feeling a strange absence of nostalgia. The building held a decade of my sweat, but it no longer held my loyalty. We walked down the carpeted hallway and approached the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. Jonathan pushed them open. My father and my sister were already sitting at the long table. The physical toll of the last 14 days was written clearly across Richard Davis. His trademark confidence had evaporated. The tailored suit he wore hung loosely on his frame, suggesting he had not eaten a full meal since the highway crash. His skin carried a pale gray pallor. His hands rested flat on the polished wood, his fingers drumming a slow, anxious rhythm. Olivia sat 2 chairs away from him. She wore a simple dark sweater, her designer accessories noticeably absent. She kept her eyes focused on a scratch in the mahogany surface, refusing to look up when we entered the room. She looked hollow, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined her entire adult life. Sitting across from them was Mitchell, their general counsel, looking exhausted and resigned to the inevitable. I did not take the seat normally reserved for subordinate managers. I walked directly to the head of the table. Preston sat on my right. Jonathan sat on my left. We did not exchange pleasantries. There was no offering of coffee or water. Preston opened his leather portfolio and initiated the discussion with the sterile cadence of a financial surgeon. He outlined the current reality of Davis Freight. He stated the numbers without inflection. The operating accounts were overdrawn. The commercial real estate lenders were preparing to file foreclosure notices by Friday. The outstanding vendor invoices exceeded $2 million, and looming over the entire structure was the $4.2 million debt owed to Apex Retail for the destroyed inventory. Preston looked at my father and stated that the corporate entity was mathematically insolvent. Liquidation was no longer a threat, it was a scheduled event. My father cleared his throat. His voice was raspy, stripped of its booming authority. He asked Preston what Vanguard Capital was proposing. He asked if the firm was offering a bridge loan to stabilize the accounts. He still harbored a faint, desperate hope that he could retain his title, his corner office, and his legacy. Preston deferred to me. He folded his hands on the table, yielding the floor. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I slid the acquisition paperwork across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided to a stop directly in front of Richard. I kept my voice even, devoid of any vindictive edge. I explained that Vanguard Capital was not offering a loan. We were executing an asset purchase agreement. In corporate restructuring, there is a fundamental difference between buying a company and buying its assets. When you buy a company, you purchase the stock, absorbing the brand, the history, and all the hidden liabilities. I had zero intention of buying Davis Freight. I told my father that my new venture, backed by Vanguard Capital, was purchasing the physical machinery. We were buying the fleet of trucks. We were acquiring the warehouse leases. We were purchasing the forklift equipment, the dispatch terminals, and the office furniture. We were buying the metal and the concrete out of the impending bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. Richard stared at the paperwork. A flicker of relief crossed his face. He misunderstood the mechanism of the deal. He looked at Mitchell, his attorney, and then back at me. He assumed that by selling the assets to my new firm, the proceeds would clear his ledger. He thought this transaction was his escape hatch, a graceful exit that would wash away his catastrophic mistakes. He leaned forward, a ghost of his former arrogance returning to his posture. He asked where the signature line was located, eager to finalize the transfer and walk away clean. Jonathan placed a hand on the documents, stopping my father from turning the page. I looked directly into Richard's eyes. I watched the momentary relief shine in his pupils, and then I extinguished it. I explained the second half of the agreement. Because we were executing an asset purchase, the corporate shell known as Davis Freight and Logistics remained entirely intact. We were extracting all the valuable resources, leaving behind an empty legal entity. And that empty entity would retain all the toxic liabilities. I pointed to Clause 7 of the acquisition document. I instructed him to read it carefully. The $4.2 million debt generated by the Silverback Transit crash was explicitly excluded from the transaction. Vanguard Capital was not assuming that liability. My new company was not absorbing that debt. The financial burden remained anchored to the Davis Freight corporate shell. My father's relief shattered. His jaw tightened. He argued that an empty shell company could not pay a $4 million invoice. He stated that Apex Retail would just force the entity into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, dissolving the debt into the ether. Jonathan shook his head. He pulled a secondary document from his briefcase and laid it next to the acquisition papers. It was a copy of the manual freight broker agreement Olivia had signed. Attached to it was the corporate charter my father had executed decades ago. I explained the concept of piercing the corporate veil. A limited liability company protects its owners from personal debt, provided the owners act within the boundaries of the law and standard fiduciary duty. But that protection evaporates the moment gross negligence is proven. My sister had bypassed all legal vetting to hire an uninsured ghost fleet currently under federal investigation. My father, as the majority owner and chairman, had actively facilitated her installation and attempted to cover up her negligence to the board of directors. I told them that Apex Retail was not going to write off the lost inventory. Their legal department had already filed the preliminary paperwork to pierce the corporate veil. They were going to attach the $4.2 million debt directly to the individuals responsible for the gross negligence. They were going to attach it to Olivia, and they were going to attach it to Richard. Olivia gasped, the sound sharp and ragged in the quiet room. She looked at our father, her eyes wide with terror, waiting for him to perform a miracle. She wanted him to use his booming voice to make the bad men in the tailored suits go away. But Richard had no miracles left. He stared at the documents, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He realized the surgical nature of the trap. I was taking his trucks. I was taking his warehouses. I was taking the very infrastructure he built his identity upon, and in return, I was leaving him and his golden child holding a chain attached to a $4 million anchor. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply presented the mathematical reality of their choices. They had demanded the authority to run a logistics network, ignoring the lethal risks inherent in the industry. Now the bill had arrived, and there was no worker bee left to pay it for them. The silence in the boardroom stretched thick and suffocating. The air conditioning hummed through the ceiling vents. My father looked down at his trembling hands, the hands that once sealed multi-million-dollar deals with a single handshake. I reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out a sleek silver pen. I set it gently on top of the acquisition paperwork. The metallic clink echoed across the mahogany table, signaling the final maneuver. The board was set. The remaining pieces were cornered. All that was left was the surrender. The silver pen rested on the pristine white paper. It was a simple object, yet it held the gravitational pull of a collapsed star. The boardroom was dead silent. The heavy acoustic panels on the walls absorbed the ambient noise of the city outside, trapping the four of us in a vacuum of our own making. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady rhythm through the ceiling vents. Richard stared at the pen. He understood the mechanism of the trap I had laid. He was a veteran of the corporate world, and while his arrogance had blinded him to the details of my software contract, his survival instinct now illuminated the brutal math of his current reality. 5 years ago, when Davis Freight expanded operations and purchased 3 new regional distribution warehouses, my father secured the commercial mortgages. The regional banks required collateral. My father, riding high on a decade of uninterrupted profit, signed personal guarantees on those loans. He pledged his suburban estate, his investment portfolios, and his private assets to secure the credit lines. He believed the company would always generate enough revenue to cover the debt service. The Vanguard Capital acquisition offer was calculated with surgical precision. Preston and I had structured the purchase price to exactly match the outstanding balance of those secured commercial real estate loans. If Richard refused to sign the asset sale, the regional banks would execute their foreclosure rights by the end of the week. They would seize the trucks, the terminals, and the equipment, but because the liquidation value of used freight assets rarely covers the principal of the loans, the banks would immediately trigger the personal guarantees. They would take his house. They would freeze his retirement accounts. They would strip him down to zero. By signing the document in front of him, he authorized Vanguard to purchase the physical assets, injecting just enough capital to satisfy the secured lenders. He would save his personal home. He would keep his private bank accounts intact. But the transaction would leave the Davis Freight corporate shell entirely empty, save for the $4.2 million unsecured liability owed to Apex Retail. Apex would pierce the corporate veil. They would file civil suits against him and Olivia for fiduciary negligence. He was staring at a choice between immediate total ruin and a prolonged, agonizing legal battle that would consume the remainder of his professional life. He was trading the executioner for a slow bleed. It was a terrible bargain, but it was the only option that kept a roof over his head. He reached out. His hand hovered over the table. The man who used to stride through the dispatch center, barking orders, now looked fragile, his fingers trembling as they closed around the smooth metal barrel of the pen. 2 chairs away, Olivia sat frozen. Her gaze was locked on the signature line bearing her printed name. For her entire life, my sister treated consequence as a foreign language she never had to learn. She operated under the assumption that a title was a magic shield. When she accepted the role of chief executive officer, she thought she was inheriting a kingdom that ran on autopilot. She spent her brief tenure curating her public image, assuming the underlying mechanics of the supply chain were beneath her notice. The reality of her signature on the Silverback Transit contract had finally pierced that delusion. She was 29 years old. She possessed an incomplete degree in public relations and a resume that now featured a catastrophic termination for gross negligence. The logistics industry is a closed ecosystem. Word of a $4 million blunder travels instantly across the network. No reputable transportation firm would ever hire her. No corporate executive would ever trust her with a budget. Her career was over before she even understood how to begin it. Worse than the unemployability was the looming Apex litigation. The retail giant possessed a legal department built to extract restitution. They would garnish her future wages. They would place liens on her assets. She would spend her 30s sitting in deposition rooms answering hostile questions from corporate litigators, trying to explain why she handed $80 million of inventory to a ghost fleet. She looked at our father, her eyes wide and hollow, silently pleading for him to conjure a solution. She wanted him to fix it, just as he had fixed the wrecked cars and the failed college courses of her youth. Richard did not look at her. He could not offer her salvation because he had none left to give. He pressed the tip of the pen against the paper. The quiet scratch of the ink flowing onto the page was the only sound in the room. He signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes. The signature, once a bold and sweeping declaration of his authority, now looked cramped and small. He finished signing the primary authorization. He turned to the second page, signing the release of the physical assets. When he reached the final addendum, he set the pen down. He did not speak. He simply pushed the thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany, sliding them until they rested in front of Olivia. Olivia stared at the pages. A single tear broke free, tracing a path through her ruined makeup, falling silently onto her dark sweater. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook so heavily she had to brace her wrist against the edge of the table to steady the point. She signed her name. The ink smeared slightly under her palm, a messy conclusion to a disastrous reign. She dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood. Richard placed his hands flat on the table. He leaned forward and pushed the completed acquisition packet back across the center divide. The documents glided over the polished surface and came to a halt directly in front of me. I placed my hand on top of the warm paper. Richard looked up. His eyes were red, the skin around them puffy and dark. The arrogance that had fueled his entire life was extinguished, leaving behind a hollow, tired old man. He looked at me, not as a subordinate, not as a worker bee, but as the architect who had just dismantled his fortress, brick by brick. He opened his mouth. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. "I am sorry." 3 words. 12 years of exploitation, 14 months of grueling negotiations, and 72 hours of deliberate chaos had finally extracted an apology. A year ago, I would have given anything to hear him say those words. I would have accepted them as a badge of honor, proof that my labor was finally recognized. But sitting at the head of the boardroom table, listening to the tremor in his voice, I felt nothing. The apology was empty. He was not sorry for overlooking my dedication. He was not sorry for giving my sister the credit for my work. He was only sorry that his actions had resulted in his own destruction. He was mourning the loss of his empire, not the loss of his daughter. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer a speech detailing my victory. True power does not require an audience, and it does not seek validation from the people it has just conquered. I felt a profound, quiet shift deep within my chest. The gravitational pull of my family, the desperate need to prove my worth to a man who was determined to ignore it, evaporated. The power dynamic was permanently inverted. I no longer needed a seat at his table, because I had just purchased the room. I nodded once, a brief, sterile acknowledgement of his statement. I opened my leather briefcase. I lifted the stack of signed documents and slid them into the primary compartment. I secured the brass clasp. The metallic snap echoed through the silent boardroom. I stood up. Jonathan and Preston rose immediately, mirroring my motion. They gathered their respective files and buttoned their suit jackets. The business of the morning was concluded. The extraction was complete. I turned my back on Richard and Olivia Davis. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The corridor was empty. The corner office, the one my sister had occupied for less than a week, sat dark and vacant. We walked past the frosted glass partitions, past the silent reception desk, and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the old regime forever. We rode down to the lobby. We walked through the glass entry doors and out into the blazing Texas heat. The black car service was waiting at the curb with the engine running. I got into the back seat. The air conditioning washed over me. I rested my hand on my briefcase, feeling the weight of the signed documents inside. The false idols had fallen. The empty corporate shell remained upstairs, waiting for the apex litigators to arrive and finish the demolition. My work there was done. The wreckage belonged to them now. But my story was not over. The physical assets I had just acquired were waiting in the yard. The trucks, the terminals, and the logistics network required a new operating system, a new name, and a new leader. The ground was clear, and it was time to build a new empire on a foundation of absolute competence. The transformation of a physical asset is a methodical, unglamorous process. You cannot erase 30 years of history overnight, but you can start by peeling the decals off the doors. 2 days after the acquisition paperwork cleared the holding accounts, I stood in the main Dallas freight yard, wearing a high-visibility vest. The summer heat baked the cracked asphalt. A crew of technicians was working down a long line of parked tractors, using heat guns and metal scrapers to strip away the old Davis Freight logos. The white paint underneath looked raw, exposed to the sun for the first time in decades. We were not just changing a corporate logo, we were purging a legacy of unearned entitlement. My new venture, backed by the capital from Vanguard, required a fresh identity. I named the corporation Meridian Logistics. I chose the word because it represents the highest point of a pathway, the peak of an arc. It was a fitting title for an enterprise built on the ashes of a collapsed dynasty. I ordered the cabs painted a deep matte charcoal, a color that hid the road grime and projected a quiet, formidable presence on the highway. The trucks were merely the skeleton. The routing software was the brain, and the workers were the heartbeat. During the 2 weeks of corporate paralysis, the drivers and dock workers had scattered, searching for stable paychecks to feed their families. I did not want to replace them with strangers. I wanted the veterans. I instructed my new human resources department to contact every driver, every warehouse manager, and every dispatch coordinator who had resigned during the blackout. I offered them their jobs back, attaching a 15% wage increase and a comprehensive health benefits package to the contracts. I knew their value because I had spent 12 years working alongside them in the trenches. When you treat laborers as critical assets instead of disposable commodities, loyalty becomes an organic byproduct. By the end of the first week, 90% of the original workforce had returned to the terminal, ready to rebuild. With the personnel in place, I returned to my home office. I opened my encrypted server panel. For 14 days, the proprietary routing matrix had sat dormant, a locked fortress withholding its secrets from the people who tried to steal it. I typed a new series of command prompts. I severed the old application programming interface connections tied to the defunct Davis freight shell. I created fresh, unrestricted pathways linked directly to the Meridian Logistics network. I pressed the Enter key. The red error logs on my screen vanished. Lines of vibrant green text cascaded down the terminal window. The matrix was awake. Within minutes, the dispatch screens at the main terminal lit up, displaying optimized freight sequences, real-time weather overlays, and automated scale tickets. The ghost ship had a captain again, and the engine was roaring to life. But a functioning fleet is useless without premium cargo. The Apex retail contract remained suspended, tethered to the negligent actions of the old regime. I needed to separate my new infrastructure from my sister's catastrophic failure. I scheduled a meeting with Carter Hayes, the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain Logistics for Apex Retail. We did not meet in the intimidating glass boardroom at his corporate headquarters. I invited him to the Meridian Logistics terminal. I wanted him to hear the hum of the diesel engines and see the optimized staging bays operating with flawless precision. Carter arrived on a Thursday morning. We sat in a newly renovated conference room overlooking the active loading docks. He brought a thick legal portfolio. I brought my tablet displaying the real-time telemetry of our active fleet. We did not waste time discussing the past. Carter was a man of data, and he recognized that the toxic elements of the previous relationship had been surgically removed. I presented a new service agreement. I did not ask for the terms we had previously negotiated. I rewrote the contract, increasing the margin to reflect the premium efficiency my proprietary software delivered. Carter reviewed the terms. He looked out the window at the charcoal trucks rolling out of the yard pulling pristine trailers. He looked at me, no longer seeing a subordinate vice president fighting for a seat at a patriarchal table. He saw a chief executive officer who owned the table. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket and signed the $80 million partnership into effect. Meridian Logistics secured the largest retail client in the region, and we did it without sacrificing a single fraction of our leverage. While my new company thrived, the natural consequences of unearned privilege continued to extract a heavy toll across town. I did not reach out to my father or my sister. I did not monitor their social media profiles or ask mutual acquaintances for updates. But in the legal and financial sectors of Dallas, certain events are too loud to ignore. Apex Retail executed their threat to pierce the corporate veil. Their litigators filed a civil lawsuit against Richard and Olivia Davis, citing gross fiduciary negligence. The empty corporate shell of Davis Freight offered zero protection. The retail giant attached liens to my father's investment accounts. They subpoenaed my sister, forcing her to sit in sterile law offices and answer grueling questions about her vendor vetting process under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. My father spent his days meeting with bankruptcy attorneys, trying to shield his personal assets from the incoming wave of litigation. The man who built his identity on commanding respect was now spending his retirement begging creditors for leniency. Olivia was unemployable in the commercial sector. She moved out of her luxury apartment and returned to our father's suburban estate, trapped in a house filled with the ghosts of their shared failure. They attempted to contact me. The cease and desist order prevented them from arriving at my doorstep, but they found creative ways to bypass the blockade. They mailed handwritten letters to my corporate office. They used secondary phone numbers to leave voicemails on my administrative line. The messages followed a predictable pattern, shifting from subtle manipulation to outright hostility. I never read the letters, I never returned the calls. I instructed my executive assistant to shred any correspondence bearing their names. Forgiveness is a concept often weaponized by toxic people to escape accountability. Society tells us that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred obligation that supersedes our own well-being. We are conditioned to believe that drawing a boundary is an act of cruelty. I learned a different truth. You can choose peace over loyalty. You can choose your own sanity over someone else's dysfunction. I walked away from the chaos and I never looked back. 6 months after the acquisition, I stood in my new corner office. The space was bright, filled with natural light and modern furnishings. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I possessed a clear view of the Dallas skyline and the sprawling, active yard of Meridian Logistics. The enterprise was operating at peak efficiency, generating record profits and setting the standard for regional freight transportation. I walked over to the wall near my mahogany desk. Hanging on the crisp white paint was a small square frame. Inside the glass rested the plastic security badge I had unclipped from my lapel during the gala. The photo was faded, the title of Vice President printed in plain black text. It was the badge I dropped on the table right before I walked out the doors of the Statler Hotel. I did not frame it to remind myself of the pain. I framed it to remind myself of the exact moment I realized my own value. I want to speak directly to you one final time. If you are sitting in a room watching people applaud a victory you built while they hand the reward to someone else, listen to me. Your worth is not defined by their inability to see it. Your competence is a weapon and your boundaries are the shield. Do not wait for a toxic system to validate your labor. Pack up your skills, draw a hard line, and build your own empire on solid ground. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep your family warm. Sometimes you just let them freeze. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found strength in these words, drop a comment below and share your own experience. Hit the subscribe button to join our community, and I will see you in the next video.